Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving deep into Indian history, specifically the British conquest of India. This one's for you, whether you're a UPSC aspirant getting ready for GS1 or just interested in how a trading company took over a whole subcontinent.
It's a story full of ambition, strategy, and opportunism. We'll uncover how the decline of powers in India gave the East India Company their chance.
Oh, and before we get too far, if you're enjoying this show, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and click that notification bell so you don't miss our future deep dives. All right, now let's get back to it. So, starting at the very beginning, what even brought the British to the East in the first place? Was it all about spices and exotic goods? Is that what got them going?
Well, those legendary riches of the East definitely played a part. I mean, who wouldn't be tempted, right?
Right.
The Portuguese had already set up these lucrative trade routes. And seeing that success, it sparked the imagination of English merchants, and they formed the East India Company, all hoping for a piece of the wealth coming from the East.
So they set up those trading posts, right? Those infamous factories. But how did they go from trading spices to actually controlling huge amounts of land?
That's where it gets really interesting. Early on, their success wasn't about brute force, you know?
Really?
Yeah. Instead, they secured their position through some really shrewd negotiation. Like, they got the royal farman from the Mughal emperor.
Ah, so playing the game right from the start.
Exactly. It granted them duty-free trading, huge advantage over their competitors.
So it gave them a leg up.
Oh, yeah. Big time.
So these factories weren't just about textiles and peppercorns, though, were they? I mean, they became centers of influence, didn't they?
Exactly. Those seemingly harmless trading posts, they slowly turned into these strategic outposts, basically the seeds of their future empire.
Wow. And all this is happening while the Mughal Empire, once so mighty, is on the decline. Was that just bad luck? Or were there bigger reasons for their downfall?
It was complex. The Mughal decline. Internal conflicts, struggles for who would be the next emperor, and just a weaker central authority overall. It all created this power vacuum, basically, and that fragmentation. It was a golden opportunity for the East India Company.
So, imagine a startup, right?
Right.
And suddenly all the big companies around it start collapsing.
Right.
The East India Company was ready to pounce.
Absolutely. They saw their chance and took it.
And they didn't waste any time, did they?
Mm-hmm.
Especially down south, during the Carnatic Wars.
Oh, the Carnatic Wars, that's a turning point for sure.
Yeah.
This is where the British learned a very valuable lesson from their rivals, the French, particularly this guy, Joseph-Francois Dupleix. Brilliant strategist. He really understood how to exploit those Indian rivalries, use them for political gain.
Wait, so the British learned their divide and conquer tactics from the French?
It might sound a bit ironic, but yeah. They saw how Dupleix, maneuvered within this complicated web of Indian alliances and rivalries, and they realized, hey, turning Indian powers against each other, that's our ticket to dominance.
And that realization, that sets the stage for their biggest win. The Battle of Plassey in 1757. Just one battle. But it changed everything for India.
Plassey, masterclass in cunning and taking advantage of the situation.
Yeah.
Robert Clive, the British commander, he wasn't just relying on better weapons. I mean, he did have those, but he was clever. He made alliances with factions who were unhappy with the Nawab of Bengal, even made sure key figures switched sides during the battle itself.
Wow. So it was about more than just winning on the battlefield, huh?
Oh, for sure.
It was about seizing control of the most important thing.
Yeah.
The money. The revenue.
Right.
That's where the Diwani comes in.
You got it. The Diwani of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, it gave the East India Company the control over all the revenue. These were wealthy provinces. And that was it. The shift from a trading company to a real governing authority.
That is so important for UPSC aspirants to grasp. I mean, the Battle of Plassey, the Diwani, those are like watershed moments.
Yeah.
They mark a complete change
Couldn't agree more.
in how the British took control of India.
Absolutely. It shows just how strategic and, let's be honest, ruthless the East India Company was. They adapted, went from being shrewd negotiators to cunning manipulators, and finally to the ones collecting all the taxes.
And this was just the start of their expansion. They set their sights on other places. From Bengal, they looked at Mysore, the Marathas, Punjab. Each one a unique challenge, needing different tactics.
Oh, yeah. Their strategies had to evolve, right? As they faced different enemies. Military force, diplomacy, alliances. They used a mix, always changing it up to fit the situation. They were relentless, that's for sure, and always ready to seize any opportunity to expand their power.
But one of their sneakiest methods, I think, was that subsidiary alliance system. On the surface, it sounded decent. Protection in exchange for some concessions, right? But the
It
reality...
was brilliant, I'll give them that.
Yeah.
But super manipulative.
Right.
Indian rulers who signed these alliances, they had to maintain British troops, couldn't hire any Europeans without permission, and had to check with the British resident before making any big decisions.
So basically, they were slowly losing all their power, became puppets.
Pretty much.
And then the infamous doctrine of lapse, which was basically just grabbing land disguised as a policy.
Oh, yeah. The doctrine of lapse. That one said if a ruler died without a direct heir, boom, the British could annex the territory.
Convenient.
Very convenient. Often used with, shall we say, questionable justifications. They used it as an excuse to expand, playing on the complexities of Indian succession laws.
Okay, so we've seen how the East India Company went from merchants to rulers, controlling a huge chunk of India, adaptable tactics, clever maneuvering. But they weren't content with just the subcontinent, were they?
You're right. They looked beyond India's borders. Their empire went into Burma, Balochistan, even parts of Nepal. They wanted power and profit. That's what drove them, building this massive web of control.
It's amazing how far their influence spread. You know, even something as simple as, let's say, Darjeeling, those beautiful tea plantations everyone loves.
Right.
Well, that land was basically a gift from the King of Sikkim to the British, in exchange for help with a border dispute, of course.
See? That's them, using diplomacy to their advantage, always thinking ahead.
Smart. But it's important to remember, this wasn't a passive takeover, right? The Indian people fought back. Mutinies, revolts, countless acts of resistance against the British.
Absolutely. You can't tell the story of the British conquest without talking about the Indian resistance. It's crucial.
Right.
From huge uprisings like the Vellore Mutiny to small local revolts and acts of defiance, the Indian people, they never just accepted being dominated.
All these acts of resistance, from peasants and tribal groups to queens and sepoys, it's all part of understanding how complex this period really was.
It is. And it speaks volumes about the courage and spirit of the Indian people, their determination to fight for their freedom.
So that wraps up part one of our deep dive into the British conquest of India. We've seen a trading company transform into this colonial powerhouse that used negotiation, military force, and some very clever manipulation.
Quite a journey, isn't it?
It is, but we also saw the beginnings of resistance, and that will ultimately challenge their hold on power. Stay tuned for part two. We'll be exploring the effects of British rule on Indian society, the economy, and its culture. It's going to be fascinating. See you there.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the British conquest of India. Last time, we looked at how the East India Company went from traders to, well, rulers, basically. Now we're going to dig into how their rule changed India's social and economic landscape. It's a long story, nearly 2 centuries.
It is. It's complicated, multifaceted. Where do we even begin to unpack all the changes they made?
Let's start with the economics. Probably the most lasting impact of British rule. See, they basically reshaped India's entire economy to benefit themselves, turned it into this supplier of raw materials and a market for their own manufactured goods.
So India basically became fuel for Britain's Industrial Revolution.
Exactly. Cotton, indigo, tea, all these valuable resources, all flowing out of India, helping Britain industrialize. But at the same time, it was holding back India's own industries from growing.
That sounds, well, pretty unfair. And this system, this drain of wealth, as it's called, that had some serious consequences, right?
Oh, yeah. The drain of wealth theory argues that British policies basically siphoned off resources and money from India, sending it straight to Britain. And that, in turn, contributed to India's underdevelopment. It's debated, of course, but it really highlights the economic inequality that was built into the whole colonial relationship.
And that economic exploitation, I mean, it had to have social consequences too, right? More poverty, hardship for the average person.
Absolutely. The decline of traditional industries plus new revenue systems like the zamindari system in Bengal, that led to tons of rural debt and displacement.
Hold on, the zamindari system, didn't that create a whole class of landlords who were often exploiting the peasants?
Yep. It was supposed to streamline how taxes were collected, but the zamindari system backfired. It concentrated land in the hands of a few. Often these landlords didn't even live on the land, and they had no reason to invest in making agriculture better. They just took huge rents from the farmers.
So even when they tried to create administrative systems, it doesn't sound like the well-being of the average Indian was really their priority.
Not really, no.
Okay, but what about governance itself? I mean, how did they actually manage to rule a place as huge and diverse as India?
They built a complex bureaucracy. Officials, courts, laws, all organized in a strict hierarchy. And this system, well, it worked in some ways, but it was often out of touch with local customs and traditions.
They basically imposed a very Western style of governing on a society that already had its own long-standing traditions, right?
Yeah, and that clash, it caused a lot of misunderstanding and resentment. Sure, they introduced some legal reforms that were good, but overall, their approach was all about control, paternalistic control. They really believed British institutions were just better.
It's interesting, though, the whole education piece, the introduction of English education, that had to be a major turning point,
It's
right?
huge. English education had this really complicated impact. On one hand, you have this whole new class of Indians educated in English, and they played a big role in the nationalist movement that was starting to grow. But at the same time, it created a divide. Lots of people didn't have access to this new education system, so they're left out.
So double-edged sword,
Yeah.
really. Empowered some, divided others.
Yeah.
It's amazing how much impact just one policy can have, you know.
Yeah, history is rarely straightforward, especially when it comes to something as big as the British Raj. They tried to reform Indian society, civilize it as they saw it, but often they were met with resistance, and there were a lot of unintended consequences.
Right, their whole civilizing mission. Didn't they try to ban Saudi and crack down on the thuggy cult?
Oh, yeah, they did. And on the surface, it might seem like they were trying to do good, but their methods were often really harsh, and they didn't really care about the complexities of Indian social customs or religious beliefs.
Like they just assumed their culture was better
Yeah.
and felt this need to force their values on everyone.
That idea, the superiority of British culture, it was a core part of the whole colonial mindset. But we have to remember, Indians weren't just passively accepting all this. They resisted, they adapted. And in the end, they forged their own path, this unique mix of traditional and modern.
And that ability to adapt and keep going, that's what led to the nationalist movement, right? Which we'll get to in the next part.
Exactly, because the British conquest wasn't just about battles and economic control. It was also about cultures clashing, ideas mixing, and identities evolving.
Wow.
And that dynamic, that's what ultimately set the stage for India's fight for independence.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've covered how the East India Company came to power, and we've dug into the lasting effects of British rule in India. Now, for this final part of our deep dive, we're shifting gears. We're going to talk about a theme that's both inspiring and essential to understanding India today, and that's resistance. Because let's be honest, the Indian people, they never just rolled over and accepted being ruled by the British. They resisted, they rebelled, and finally, they won their freedom back.
And what's really interesting about this resistance is how diverse it was. It wasn't just about picking up arms and fighting, though that did happen, of course.
Of course.
But there were so many forms of resistance, protests, religious movements, boycotts, even social reform movements, and slowly this idea of a national consciousness started to emerge, and that challenged the whole idea that the British had any right to rule in the first place.
It's like all these different threads coming together to form a tapestry, right?
Yeah.
Each one representing a different way of resisting, a different vision for what a free India could look like. But if we want to understand where this resistance really began, where should we look?
Well, the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857, that's a huge turning point.
Yeah.
Often people see it as just a military uprising, triggered by those greased cartridges.
Right, right.
But it was so much more than that. It was the culmination of decades of anger,
Yeah.
resentment against British policies, the economic exploitation, and this feeling that their culture, their traditions were under attack.
It wasn't just about the cartridges themselves. It was a symbol
Yes.
of everything that was wrong with the colonial system. And even though the British crushed the mutiny, it changed things, both for the British AD, for the Indians. I mean, it left its mark.
Oh, absolutely. The 1857 uprising, it showed that the British weren't invincible. And that realization, it was fuel for this growing sense of Indian nationalism. Things were shifting. The path was opening up for a more organized, more focused fight for independence.
So the mutiny was a wake-up call. Things couldn't go back to how they were.
Right.
What happened next? How did this new sense of national identity start to take shape?
Well, after the mutiny, you start to see organized nationalist groups forming, like the Indian National Congress, founded in 1885. At first, they were all about getting more Indians involved in the British government, working within the system. But over time, they started demanding full independence, complete freedom from British rule.
And this movement, it wasn't just one big group with the same ideas, was it? There were different factions, different beliefs, about the best way to achieve their goals.
Exactly. And that's a really important point to understand about this period, the Indian nationalist movement. It was a mix of all sorts of people, moderate reformers, radical revolutionaries. They didn't always agree. And that's what made them so strong. In the end, they kept adapting, they were resilient.
And it wasn't just about politics, right? There were cultural and social reform movements happening too, trying to bring back Indian culture, to challenge the idea that Western ways were superior.
That's right, like the Bengal Renaissance. This was a time when Indians were rediscovering their own art, literature, and philosophy. And this cultural revival, it was a huge part of the nationalist movement. It instilled this pride in being Indian. It pushed back against that whole colonial narrative.
So it was this multifaceted fight for freedom, political, social, cultural, all happening at once. And of course, we can't talk about India's fight for independence without talking about Gandhi. His philosophy of nonviolent resistance, that brought people together like nothing else. And it ultimately led to India gaining its independence in 1947.
Gandhi's leadership was crucial, there's no doubt about that. But we have to remember, he didn't come out of nowhere. He built on the work of countless others who had been fighting for freedom for decades. Their sacrifices, their struggles, all led to this moment.
Gandhi's brilliance was that he could bring all these different threads together, unite them into a single powerful movement, and focus that energy towards one goal.
That's the heart of our deep dive here. The British conquest of India, it wasn't just a historical event. It was civilizations clashing, a story of ambition, of exploitation, but also a story of resistance. And in the end, a story of resilience.
And that history, it's still shaping the India we see today. This legacy, it makes us think about colonialism, about power, and about the incredible strength of the human spirit.
As we wrap up this deep dive, think about the lasting impacts of this period on modern India. How did colonial rule affect its politics, its social structures, even its sense of identity?
And to all our UPSC aspirants out there, don't just memorize dates and battles. That's important, sure. But it's understanding the bigger picture, the why behind it all, that will make your analysis shine.
Go beyond the textbooks, explore different sources, read different perspectives, and never stop asking questions.
That's what real learning is all about. And that's how you truly understand the richness, the complexity of history. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the British conquest of India. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on future deep dives. We'll see you next time.